Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive. Today we're going to be tackling extradition,
Extradition.
which is always a pretty hot button issue,
Yeah,
and especially relevant, I think, for our UPSC aspirants out there who are, gearing up for those mains exams.
absolutely.
We've got some fascinating source material to dig into today, including the actual India-Bangladesh extradition treaty.
Oh, wow.
But, what's really got everyone talking is this recent news. Bangladesh has officially asked India to extradite their former Prime Minister, Sheikh Hasina.
It's really a situation that, puts a spotlight on the intricacies of international relations and how they intersect with domestic law.
Exactly. So for our listeners, who might not be totally up to speed, can we just break down what extradition actually is and why it matters so much to the world of diplomacy?
Yeah, so extradition, in the simplest terms, is like a legal handshake between two countries. They agree to hand over individuals accused of serious crimes committed in each other's territories. Think of it as a way of ensuring that justice can be served, even when someone tries to flee across borders.
Okay, that makes sense. So it's not just about catching criminals. It's about countries cooperating to uphold the rule of law, right?
Absolutely, and that's why extradition treaties are so important. They lay out the ground rules for this cooperation, specifying what crimes are covered, what evidence is needed, and what safeguards are in place to ensure a fair process.
So in this case with Sheikh Hasina, we're talking about the India-Bangladesh extradition treaty signed back in 2013. What's the backstory here? What led to Bangladesh making this request?
Yeah. So Sheikh Hasina fled to India in August after protests ended her rule in Bangladesh.
Right.
Bangladesh has since issued arrest warrants, accusing her of crimes against humanity and even genocide.
Wow. Those are some extremely serious allegations. It sounds like a very politically charged situation. So how does the treaty itself come into play here? Does it automatically mean India has to hand her over?
It's not that straightforward.
Okay.
The treaty does lay out a process for extradition, but it's not an automatic you ask, we give situation. There are lots of legal hurdles and conditions that have to be met.
So for our UPSC folks who might get a question about this on their exam, what are some of the key things they need to know about this treaty?
First off, it's important to understand that the treaty isn't just about high-profile political figures like Sheikh Hasina.
Okay.
It covers a whole range of offenses, everything from terrorism and drug trafficking to financial crimes.
So it's a pretty comprehensive agreement.
Yes, and it was initially driven by concerns about insurgents and militants operating across the India-Bangladesh border. Both countries wanted a mechanism to deal with those security threats.
Makes sense. So someone accused of a crime in Bangladesh could potentially seek refuge in India and vice versa.
Exactly, and that's where the treaty comes in. It says that if someone is charged with or wanted for an offense punishable by at least 1 year in prison in both countries, they can be extradited.
Ah, so there's that concept of dual criminality that you often hear about in international law.
Precisely. Both India and Bangladesh have to agree that the alleged act is a crime for extradition to even be considered. It's a way of ensuring some level of consensus and preventing abuse of the system.
Okay, that's a crucial point. But even if a crime meets that dual criminality test, does that mean extradition is guaranteed? Are there any escape hatches in the treaty?
You're catching on quick.
Okay.
You're right. There are a few key provisions that allow India to refuse an extradition request, and these are super important for understanding the complexities of this case.
Okay, let's dive into those. This is where it gets really interesting for anyone trying to grasp the nuances of international law, right?
Absolutely. One of the big ones is what's known as the political offense exception. If India believes that the request for extradition is politically motivated, say, to target someone for their beliefs rather than for legitimate criminal activity they can refuse.
That makes sense. It protects people from being unfairly targeted for their political views, right? But are there any exceptions to that exception?
You're sharp.
Okay.
You're absolutely right. Even if there's a political element, the treaty says certain crimes are just too serious to be ignored. Things like murder, torture, or enforced disappearance can't be brushed aside simply by claiming they were politically motivated.
So even if an offense has political connections, if it involves these heinous crimes, extradition is still on the table.
Exactly. And there are a couple of other loopholes, too. India can refuse if they believe the request isn't made in good faith, or if it's based solely on military offenses that aren't considered violations of general criminal law.
Wow, so there's a lot of room for interpretation and judgment calls here. It's not as black and white as it might seem at first glance. So knowing all of this, how has India actually responded to Bangladesh's request? Have they made a decision?
this. India has officially confirmed receiving the request, but is playing it very cautiously. They've stated they need to thoroughly examine the legal grounds before making any decisions.
Sounds like a delicate diplomatic dance.
It really is. And to add another layer of complexity, Sheikh Hasina hasn't exactly been keeping a low profile since arriving in India. She's made some pretty strong statements about the current interim government in Bangladesh.
Oh, like what?
Well, she's publicly accused them of some very serious things, including genocide, persecution of minorities, and even attacks on places of worship during those protests that led to her departure.
That certainly complicates things. How has Bangladesh responded to those statements?
They're not happy, to say the least.
Okay.
The interim government has expressed serious concerns, claiming Hasina's statements are creating unnecessary tension between the two nations.
This whole situation sounds like a diplomatic tightrope walk for India. What are some of the key things our listeners, especially those UPSC aspirants, should be thinking about as we try to unpack the implications of all of this?
I think the biggest takeaway is that this case highlights the interplay of domestic politics, international law, and regional dynamics. India has to weigh its legal obligations under the treaty with its strategic interests in maintaining a good relationship with Bangladesh.
Right. It's not just about following the letter of the law. It's about navigating a complex web of political and diplomatic considerations.
Exactly. And that's what makes this case so fascinating, especially for those prepping for the UPSC exams. It's a real-world example of how these theoretical concepts actually play out on the global stage.
Well said. We've covered a lot of ground in this first part, from the basics of extradition to the specifics of the India-Bangladesh Treaty and the current controversy surrounding Sheikh Hasina. But we're just getting started.
Yeah.
In part 2, we'll delve deeper into those regional dynamics and explore the potential consequences of India's decision, whatever it may be.
And we'll leave you with a question to ponder in the meantime. What factors do you think will ultimately influence India's decision regarding Sheikh Hasina's extradition? Think about it, and we'll pick up this thread in part 2.
Great question. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button and share this deep dive with your fellow UPSC buddies.
Yeah.
We'll be back soon with more insights and analysis. See you in part 2.
Welcome back, everyone. I hope you've had a moment to consider that question we left you with.
Yeah.
Those factors that might be, swirling around in the minds of Indian policymakers as they grapple with this extradition request.
It's a real head scratcher, isn't it?
It is.
You've got the legal framework of the treaty,
Yeah.
but then you layer on the political realities, the accusations against Hasina, her own, fiery statements, and then the always delicate balance of these regional relationships.
And for our UPSC aspirants, this is exactly the kind of scenario that tests your understanding of how domestic issues and foreign policy intertwine. It's not just about knowing the law, it's about grasping that bigger picture.
Okay, so let's zoom out a bit and talk about those regional dynamics.
Yeah.
What's at stake for India in terms of its relationship with Bangladesh, depending on how this whole thing plays out?
Well, imagine you're holding a scale, trying to keep it perfectly balanced.
Okay.
On one side, you have the current Bangladeshi government, eager to see Hasina extradited.
Right.
If India complies, it could be seen as a sign of support for this government, potentially strengthening ties.
But on the other side of that scale, we have Sheikh Hasina herself. I mean, she's been a significant figure in Bangladeshi politics for years, has her own supporters, her own alliances.
Exactly. And she's been, quite friendly towards India during her time in power.
Right.
Extraditing her could alienate those who see her as a key partner and potentially create future roadblocks for India and Bangladesh.
So it's like India's walking a tightrope, trying not to tip the scales too far in either direction.
That's a great analogy. And it goes beyond just managing relationships with political factions. There's the broader regional stability to consider.
Right. We can't forget that Bangladesh is a crucial neighbor for India. They share a long border, deep cultural and historical ties, and there's a lot of collaboration on issues like trade and security.
Any instability in Bangladesh could easily have ripple effects across the border, impacting India in various ways. Think about the potential for increased migration, cross-border crime, or even a resurgence of militant activity in the region.
Those are serious concerns. So from a purely strategic standpoint, it seems like India has a strong incentive to make sure things don't get too messy in Bangladesh.
Absolutely. And this brings us back to the extradition treaty and those provisions that give India some wiggle room.
You're right. We talked about that political offense exception. Are there any other factors that might be particularly relevant in this case?
Well, remember that 2016 amendment we mentioned?
Hmm.
It simplified the extradition process by removing the need for extensive evidence. Now, an arrest warrant from a competent court is essentially enough.
So on the surface, it seems like a slam dunk for Bangladesh. But given the political sensitivities, it's clear that India is proceeding with caution. What else might be factoring into their decision-making process?
Public perception is a big one, both domestically and internationally.
Okay.
How India handles this case will be scrutinized by the world, and their implications for their image on the global stage.
I mean, India has been working hard to position itself as, a rising power, a champion of democracy and human rights.
Right.
Handing over a former head of state to a government accused of human rights abuses could raise eyebrows.
Exactly. And then there's the issue of legal precedent. If India sets a standard of extraditing political figures based on potentially shaky grounds, it could come back to haunt them in future cases, even domestically.
So there are long-term implications to consider as well.
Definitely. This case is like a chess game.
Okay.
Every move has to be carefully calculated.
So given all of this, what are some of the potential scenarios that might unfold? What are the possible endgame moves for India in this situation?
One option is simply to delay a decision. India could cite the need for further legal review, buying some time to assess the situation and potentially find a diplomatic solution.
That seems like a classic tactic in international diplomacy, kicking the can down the road a bit to avoid making a hasty decision.
It's a time-honored tradition.
Yeah.
Another possibility is that India could grant asylum to Sheikh Hasina, essentially rejecting the extradition request outright.
That would be a bold move. What kind of message would that send?
It would signal that India prioritizes its relationship with Hasina over its current ties with Bangladesh.
Okay.
It could lead to some frosty relations and potential consequences like economic sanctions or even military tensions. It's a high-risk, high-reward kind of move.
Definitely not something to be taken lightly. Are there any options that might offer a more moderate path forward, something less drastic?
There's always the possibility of negotiated settlement. Maybe India could try to broker a deal where Hasina agrees to return to Bangladesh voluntarily, perhaps under certain conditions or guarantees.
So finding a compromise that allows both sides to save face and avoid a complete rupture in relations.
Exactly. It would require some delicate back-channel diplomacy, but it's a potential way out of this impasse.
So even with the treaty in place, this is far from a simple legal matter.
No.
It's a web of political calculations, diplomatic maneuvering, and ethical considerations.
And that's what makes it such a great case study for our UPSC aspirants.
Right.
It demonstrates how real-world events often defy neat textbook definitions.
Absolutely. It's a reminder that international relations is a dynamic field constantly evolving. But we're not done yet.
Yeah.
There's one more crucial aspect of this case we need to examine.
You're right. We've talked about the treaty and the politics, but we haven't really delved into the substance of the allegations against Sheikh Hasina. Those accusations are at the heart of this whole extradition request.
That's a great point. It's easy to get caught up in the geopolitical drama, but at the end of the day, this involves a woman accused of very serious crimes.
Precisely. And exploring those accusations, along with the legal and ethical questions they raise, is where we're headed next in the final part of this deep dive.
Stay tuned, everyone. We'll be back soon to unpack the final layer of this complex case. Welcome back to the final part of our deep dive into this whole extradition saga.
Yeah.
We've dissected the treaty, explored the political chess game.
Right.
Now it's time to tackle, the elephant in the room, the actual allegations against Sheikh Hasina.
Yeah, you're right. We can't just gloss over those. After all, these accusations are, the very foundation of Bangladesh's request.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So for our listeners, who might have missed the earlier parts, can we just recap what Bangladesh is actually accusing Hasina of?
They're alleging crimes against humanity and even genocide stemming from the events that led to her departure from Bangladesh.
Okay.
Essentially, they claim that she was responsible for widespread violence and persecution of minorities during that turbulent period.
Wow, those are incredibly serious charges. Can you give us some specifics, like what kind of evidence are they presenting to support these claims?
Well, they're pointing to a pattern of violence targeting religious minorities, including attacks on places of worship and allegations of targeted killings.
Right.
They're also claiming that Hasina either directly ordered or at the very least condoned these actions.
It sounds like a very complicated and sensitive situation.
Yeah.
But it's crucial to remember that these are just accusations at this point,
Well,
right?
absolutely.
She hasn't been found guilty of anything in a court of law.
The presumption of innocence is a cornerstone of any justice system, and that's a key factor India has to consider.
Right.
Even if the treaty allows for extradition, they have a responsibility to ensure she would receive a fair trial if sent back to Bangladesh.
That makes sense. I mean, India can't simply hand someone over without being confident that they'll be treated justly.
Exactly, and that's where things get really interesting from a legal and ethical standpoint. India can't just blindly follow the treaty, They have to weigh their obligations under international human rights law as well.
So they're juggling multiple sets of responsibilities here.
That's right. India has signed various treaties and conventions that obligate them to protect individuals from arbitrary detention and unfair trials. So they're not just evaluating the legality of the extradition request itself.
Right.
They're also scrutinizing the integrity of the Bangladeshi legal system.
Wow. It's like peeling back layers of an onion.
Yeah.
Every time we think we've grasped the situation, there's like another layer of complexity.
It's a perfect example of how interconnected international law, domestic politics, and human rights can be. And for our UPSC aspirants, this case is a goldmine of insights. It shows how theoretical concepts play out in the real world with real consequences.
Absolutely. It's a reminder that international relations is rarely black and white.
Right.
There are so many nuances, so many competing interests and obligations.
And ultimately, India has to make a tough call. Whatever decision they make, it will have significant repercussions, both domestically and internationally.
It's a real high-stakes dilemma, and it's fascinating to watch unfold. As we wrap up this deep dive, what are some of the key questions our listeners should be pondering, as they continue to follow this case?
Well, I think one of the biggest questions is, what message will India's decisions send to the world? Will they be seen as prioritizing their relationship with Bangladesh over potential human rights concerns? Or will they take a stand for due process, even if it means straining diplomatic ties?
Those are some heavy questions, and there are no easy answers.
That's the nature of international relations. It's messy, it's complex, and it forces us to grapple with tough moral and ethical dilemmas. But by engaging with these issues, by thinking critically and challenging assumptions, we can all gain a deeper understanding of how the world works.
Well said. And that's exactly what we aim to do here on the Deep Dive. Thanks for joining us on this exploration. We encourage you to, keep digging deeper, stay informed, and never stop questioning.
And if you found this deep dive helpful, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and share it with your friends, especially those fellow UPSC aspirants.
Yeah.
Together, we can unravel the complexities of our world one episode at a time.
Until next time, keep those brains buzzing and keep on diving deep.